Hello and welcome to Negotiating Government, the podcast from Negotiant. I'm Miranda Worthington, Senior Associate at Negotiant, based in our London office. I'm here with Joshua Flax, founding partner of Negotiant and our United States lead.
Hey, Miranda. Good afternoon from Massachusetts, United States. I'm really happy to be here with you today.
As any of our London listeners will know, we had a tube strike that lasted a week in London in September, organised by the RMT union over pay and working conditions. And both Josh and I are really interested in strikes. I was the HSC's Director of Industrial Relations during the period of NHS strikes from late 2022 to 2024. Josh, do you want to say a little bit about your interest in strikes?
Yeah, I spent over 20 years as a United States federal mediator on this side of the pond, and I finished working there in 2023 as the Deputy Director of the U.S. Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. And one of the core missions of that organization is to help parties to avoid strike and lockout in the private sector.
And I hope we'll get into some of that in more detail as we get into it. But prompted by these tube strikes, Josh and I thought it would be interesting to start a series of podcasts on strikes, industrial relations, labour relations, the first of which is today's, and we're going to be talking about what is a strike, what are different types of strike, and what are the impacts of strike. And hopefully we will come on to matters such as tactical considerations and how to avoid strikes in the first place and how to resolve them in future episodes.
Well, I'm really pleased that we're talking about strikes today because some of them can be extremely damaging and affect large parts of a regional or local economy or even beyond. The interesting thing about a strike is that in both of our countries, most people have never actually been on strike.
Yeah.
That's extremely unusual. However, many people have been impacted by strikes in one way, shape, or form. And it's worth, I think, diving into that for a minute, Miranda.
Yes. And when we were talking about this before, I think we established that in the UK, nearly everybody has been affected by a strike in recent years, whether directly or indirectly. And you were saying that's not necessarily true in the States.
No, I think what's interesting is that in the UK, when you have a very large scale work stoppage, like a tube strike or a healthcare provision strike, whether it's doctors or nurses, of course, it's going to affect huge swaths of your population. In the United States, it tends to be more local in impact with a strike that affects people in a particular city or region. But because the country's so large, the spillover effects to other areas of the country tend to be fairly minimal, with the exception of the Screen Actors Guild strike last year, which we will get to.
I think it's possible that one of the reasons for those differences is partly about the geography of the countries and perhaps about federalism in the United States. But is it also because most commonly, not always, of course, but most commonly in the UK, strikes are public sector strikes, where staff are walking out on a national level or are taking action that affects large numbers of the public because they are public sector strikes. Whereas in the States, it's much more unusual, if I understand correctly, for public sector workers to go on strike, and it's more a private sector phenomenon.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. In fact, in most states, it's illegal for public sector workers to go out on strike. And certainly it's illegal for federal employees to go out on strike. But here in the private sector, you still have large areas of organized labor in critical industries where it's perfectly legal to go out on strike. And in fact, they do. And that could include in healthcare, it could include manufacturing, telecommunications, transportation, trucking, and even rail, which is one of our topics today.
Maybe that leads us to sort of starting at the beginning. And I'd like to ask you, Josh, what is a strike? Can you explain for our listeners the basics of what a strike is?
Of course, in the most basic sense, it's simply a withdrawal of labor where an organized group of workers all together, it's a form of collective action, is the thing that we should probably underscore, decide that they would rather stop working and stop receiving a paycheck as a way of communicating to the employer that the current working conditions and terms or the proposed working conditions and terms of a future collective bargaining agreement are unsatisfactory.
Thanks so much, Josh. I wonder if you could just explain at a high level for our listeners what a collective bargaining agreement is.
Yeah, sure, of course, Miranda. For about 100 years in the United States, and I believe for longer in the United Kingdom, it's legal for workers to organize together into an association or an organization, or in fact, as we both sides of the pond describe them, as a union or a trade union or a labor union. And the purpose of doing so is to actually negotiate the terms and conditions of providing their work to the employer, to that particular work activity, collectively, rather than every single worker at that facility negotiating their own terms and conditions with the employer. Once you do it collectively, that brings up a kind of team on team dynamic where the workers all organize themselves in order to prepare a series of proposals for the employer, and the employer organizes themselves into a negotiating team as well. And you kind of get one side across the table from the other, discussing the terms under which those workers will provide their labor to that employer for that work activity. And the product of those negotiations will be called the collective bargaining agreement because it's done collectively by all the workers. And crucially, they all have to live under the final agreement if once it's been agreed to.
Thanks, Josh. That's really interesting. And I've heard you talk in Negotiant a number of times about the relationship between a workforce and the employer being a bit like a marriage without a divorce. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit about that metaphor for our listeners.
Yeah, it's a bit of a creative and a bit of an illustrative metaphor in such a way that it gives people a sense of what is it like to live with a collective bargaining agreement. So under the law in both of our countries, once there is a collective bargaining relationship in place, it's very hard to end it, which basically means that both sides have to live with each other, even when they're extremely displeased with each other. And in that sense, it's like a long-term relationship, like a marriage. However, there is no clear possibility of divorce under the law in pretty much 99% of collective bargaining relationships. And so what that really means day to day, well, since management owns the work activity and the means of production or delivery, right, and the union controls the workforce, it actually does take a marriage of give and take from both parties to make it all work very smoothly. But when it doesn't work smoothly, neither party has the ability to leave because it always takes both parties to make it work. Neither one can run the enterprise by themselves. So since they're stuck with each other, they have to try and figure out how to have a marriage that works.
And so a strike is, in that context, a way of expressing displeasure and raising the alarm that something is wrong in the marriage without actually leaving it.
Yeah, that's an excellent way of thinking about it, right? Since there is no possibility of divorce, both parties need ways of expressing themselves when they're extremely dissatisfied with the other party. And in the case of the labor management relationship, the union can call for a strike when they're unable to agree on terms of a new collective bargaining agreement with the employer. That's their way of expressing it. And at least on this side of the pond, the employer actually has a similar economic weapon, as we call them. The employer can declare a lockout, which effectively is the same exact thing as a strike, excepting it's the employer who gets to push the button.
Yes, this is really interesting because I don't think we have had many, if any, of those in the UK. So could you, is that something that happens frequently in the States?
It does not happen very frequently, but when it does happen, they're usually very high profile. So, for example, in 2012, the entirety of the National Hockey League, which is the professional hockey sports association in the United States and Canada, all of the players at the Hockey League have a union, the National Hockey League Players Association, it's called, and they were really unhappy with the quality of the collective bargaining negotiations with the National Hockey League in 2012, and they publicly signaled as such. They did talk a little bit publicly about whether they were going to threaten to go on strike or not. Interestingly, the employer, the National Hockey League, employer of every single professional hockey player at that level in the United States and Canada, decided they didn't want to wait to see what the union was going to do, whether the union was going to call for a strike or not. So they instituted a lockout. And this became fairly famous in North America, at least for professional hockey fans, because nearly 4 months of the hockey season was ruined or lost due to the lockout. And in that case, the players did not actually declare a strike. The employer locked them out first.
Is it right to say the employer was doing that indefinitely until the disagreement between them was resolved?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Miranda. Over on this side of the pond, labor disputes that end up in strike or lockout, those conditions tend to be indefinite. So the union doesn't strike and the employer doesn't lock out, excuse me, the union calls for a strike or the employer institutes a lockout, and they don't say when the strike or the lockout is going to end. So they're by definition indefinite. And as far as I understand, that's actually quite different than in the UK when you're talking, for example, about a tube strike or a doctor's strike.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think the last major indefinite strike here was the miners' strike in 1984, so a very long time ago. More commonly here, strikes will either be kind of standalone and they'll do a strike and then you wait for the union to announce its next move, or they attempt to return to the negotiating table and work out what their next move will be. Or there is a kind of element of a rolling strike, by which I mean a union might strike every fortnight for 6 months. Or in the case of the resident doctors who were on strike quite a lot between 2023 and 2024, though they did not declare a very clear rhythm, they did say that they would be on strike every month for the period that they had a mandate to do so, and they largely fulfilled that. And that can be incredibly disruptive because Transport Network, in the case of the Tube or the NHS, has to prepare for each strike, manage the period of strike, and then get everything back in place afterwards, which doesn't leave that much time unaffected by strike in between. And from the union's perspective, it means that the workers are losing less pay proportionate to how much disruption they can cause.
Oh, that's really interesting. And so just for North American listeners here, when you say rolling strike, what you mean is a recurring strike. So, for
Right.
example, tube operators, train drivers, and other people that work in the London Underground might go on strike for a few days this month and then go back to work, and then go on strike again for a few days
Exactly.
next month and then go back to work. Okay.
And that can be particularly impactful. For example, there's a number of unions in the transport space. If they synchronize such that one union is on strike and then another, the workers are taking it in turns to lose pay, but they're creating this kind of patchwork of very difficult service provision, or very difficult for employers to manage. The downside, I think, of those types of strike is that if the employer adapts to this rhythm, then the union has lost some of its power by by creating something that the employer can adapt to.
Well, let's talk about the tube strike for just a minute, since you've, as I understand it, you've recently had one, which I think lasted a number of days or even a full week. Tell me about tube strikes in the post-pandemic era. Now, what happens in the greater London area? Does everybody just shrug and say, oh, I'm going to work from home and do virtual meetings that week?
I think that there was a considerable amount of disruption, and people felt it. Whether people felt it as much as they would have done in 2018, well, I'm sure that the impact was lesser because people are much more prepared to work from home and take meetings virtually. And I would be really interesting to know how much that change in impact is factored into the way that the RMT go about planning their strikes and thinking about the impact that they'll have. And actually, Josh, this reminds me of your metaphor about divorce or a marriage without divorce. And I wonder whether it is possible in the United States for an employer to replace a workforce wholesale. Can that happen?
In the United States, legally, it can happen. In practice, it almost never happens, because if the employer were to replace the entire workforce that's out on strike, they would have a significant ramping up period to train up a new workforce quickly. Whereas in most cases, it's actually more economical for the employer to just kind of wait it out, to keep negotiating, try and resolve the strike, and get the people who actually know how to do the job of that work activity, whether it's to run those machines or to drive those routes or to essentially efficiently carry out the duties in that work activity. It's much less expensive for them to wait. If you think about it, from even from an HR perspective, replacing an entire striking workforce would be like having a 100% churn rate for the rest of basically your fiscal year, and that could kill any enterprise. It does occasionally happen in very, very long strikes that the employer does start to permanently replace those workers, but it's less usual.
Yeah. And I think here, in the types of workforces that we've been talking about today, it's implausible for the employer to simply replace the workforce. I mean, the consultants were on strike. The consultant doctors were on strike in 2023 and early 2024. And, it takes a minimum of 13 years, I think, to train an NHS consultant. There's absolutely no way the government could look to replace such specialized workforce.
Yeah, I totally agree, especially with this interesting difference across the pond between the United States and the United Kingdom, where so many of your most crippling work stoppages and strikes are in the public sector. Yeah, it would take a huge amount of effort to replace striking doctors or striking firefighters or striking teachers or even tube drivers. Can't be trained overnight. There's a safety issue, right? And so replacing the workforce is really much less of an option. The other thing, and this is similar to labor law in both of our countries, is that just replacing the workers doesn't actually remove the union leadership that those workers legally voted under an election that was deemed acceptable and fair. If those workers voted to bring in a labor union, well, the organized labor union structure is still in place, even if those workers individually were to somehow lose their jobs due to a work stoppage. And so the employer is left with having to deal with the same labor organization, even if the individual workers themselves are different.
That's a really interesting point. I wonder whether we segue now onto talking a little bit about who feels it, the kind of consequences and impacts of strikes from a range of perspectives. And I think one of the things that you said at the beginning is that strikes are a serious matter. They can have very far-reaching impacts. And I think it would be good to just pick through those a bit.
So in the United Kingdom, when you have, for example, when you have a tube strike, it's going to be, millions and millions, tens of millions of people have their lives impacted for a very short amount of time. And then the tube operators all go back to work in the hopes that the employer is going to come back to the negotiating table and the parties are eventually going to work it out. In the United States, with the indefinite strike being the usual way that it works, the level of disruption can be completely different and equally damaging, but manifest in different ways. So, for example, if you have a major teaching hospital in your metropolitan area and 1,000 or 2,000 nurses who work there all go out on strike, the employer is going to have to figure out a way how to run the institution, how to run that healthcare facility with a vastly smaller workforce. It's not feasible to suddenly transfer out every single patient that needs care, right? Or the employer is going to have to come up with an organized method of shutting down the entire facility starting weeks before the strike. Otherwise, you run the serious public health risk of nurses literally walking off the job while there are surgeries underway or other patient care activities happening right at that moment. And so there are numerous examples of how a work stoppage like a strike or a lockout in the United States context can have an immediate impact on our communities.
Yes. And of course, the other thing to think about from the perspective of the employer is the reputational impact, where depending on the context of the strike and who the employer is, that could be a very strong component of the way that they approach the problem. And in this case, in the UK, in recent examples of strike have really been against the government. So the unions in question are leveraging not just the impact on service delivery, but also the reputational impact on government for being perceived to allow strikes to take place.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that's so interesting about this conversation about the similarities and differences in our industrial labor relations systems on both sides of the pond. So, broadly speaking, the legal frameworks are actually really similar, but it's the manifestation of how trade unionism is carried out and industrial labor relations, right, between employers and unions is carried out on in both of our countries. That's a little bit different. It is very unusual to have a work stoppage or a strike of some sort in the United States that has some kind of a political end or is viewed as political means, right? Or to threaten some kind of political power base or governmental authority or leadership. Usually in the United States, it's mainly about the terms and conditions of work, whether that's wages, health insurance, pension, other things about the way work is scheduled and carried out at that workplace.
And then I suppose the next party to talk about is the workers themselves, where, you know, they will most notably lose pay from striking. And in some cases, they may make up some of that pay through overtime work that comes through as a result of the employer wanting to catch up on loss of activity through the strike. But overall, there are some serious consequences, especially for lower paid members of staff who are forfeiting pay without necessarily the promise of recouping that afterwards, or at least in the hope of recouping that and some afterwards. But there's also, I think, in some workplaces, depending on how unionized the rest of the workforces in your workplace are, this may lead to some workplace tension or perhaps some improved solidarity in the workplace. But it is quite a serious decision and can affect your working environment materially.
Actually, I think that's really interesting, Miranda, because most of the time, workers out on strike for any length of time will actually never make up that pay that they've lost, even over a period sometimes of several years, even if that strike does result in improvements to the wage rate in the successor collective bargaining agreement. But if they've gone out on strike for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or even longer, they've lost so much from their paycheck in year one that they won't actually be made fully whole by the end of year 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how long that collective bargaining agreement is going to run. So it does bring up the question of, what motivates those workers to still go out on strike? They're not stupid. They know exactly what's going on. They understand that it's going to take them years to make up the pay they're going to lose by striking that employer or by being locked out of that work activity. What's going on here is that the union as a whole is exercising this notion of collective action that we brought up earlier. And the idea here is that individual workers might lose pay, but the collective bargaining agreement itself to benefit all of the workers in that bargaining unit, in that group, not just the ones in service today, but the ones in service years from now, will benefit from the baseline of the paychecks being set higher. And so when they go out on strike, what they're really doing is they're talking about future wages. They're talking about setting the baseline in that new collective bargaining agreement higher to benefit everybody, including benefiting people that might not have even been hired yet.
Interesting. And I do think this is another area of difference between, I guess, probably predominantly a difference between the indefinite strike that we see more often in the States versus the rolling strike that we see more often in the UK. I think with a rolling strike, overall workers will probably lose less pay because they are in work, 7/8 of each month, maybe. They're making up some of the time that they didn't work during the strike through overtime before and afterwards. And depending on the profession or the union's attitude, they may be making up the money in some other ways. So it's a really interesting point about the culture around it in the United States, which I'm not sure is necessarily replicated here. I guess it would be really interesting to talk a little bit about a strike from a union's perspective. I mean, you said a bit there about what's motivating the union in terms of future improvements, but it must be very difficult for a union leader to know when to call a strike and when to stop striking.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Most organized labor groups think very carefully before they call a strike, whether it's going to be a rolling strike or an indefinite strike. And they have to feel that they've run out of other options at the collective bargaining table, such that a work stoppage, and the other way of describing a work stoppage is some kind of industrial action, right? So that industrial action is the only thing that's going to entice the other side to make some meaningful changes in the other side's bargaining positions and bargaining proposals. The problem that we get to is that, let's say you have a workforce of 500 factory workers, or maybe you have a workforce of 5,000 subway train drivers or tube drivers and operators. Well, if those folks are all fired up right at the collective bargaining process, and there's a lot of solidarity and unity and feeling like they're really going to use an industrial action to get that employer to meaningfully change their position at the table. Well, with all of that energy that has been expended and built, right, to help those workers get inspired, right, to conduct that industrial action. Now they're out on strike. Well, how do you get them back to work? What's the new condition or the change in condition that has to happen for the union leader to say to everybody, okay, something has changed meaningfully, and everybody should put down their placards and put down their banners and their signs and go back to work tomorrow morning. And it turns out, as we study industrial action large scale over many decades in both of our countries, that it's much harder to get people to go back to work than it is to lead them out on strike in the first place.
That's right. And in order to do a really good job, you've both got to coalesce your members around a really clear, ambitious cause, but also have a dose of realism about what you're likely to achieve, which will never be exactly what you're asking for. And then to manage to communicate that to your members in a way that gets them to agree to go back to work when that is the most appropriate thing to do, or the thing that's in their best interest. It's a very tricky balance.
It's a really tricky balance. And the other thing that's really interesting about it is, even if those of us who, let's say, aren't connected or don't know what's really going on in a particular industrial action or a labor dispute between an employer and a union, we just read about it in the newspaper, right? And then in the newspaper, it'll say, well, these workers have decided to go out on strike to try and improve their pay and benefits, et cetera, and it'll provide some additional detail about what's going on there. What the journalists frequently never seem to report on is whether those union leaders have already baked into their plan how are they going to get the workforce back to work, right? So internally, their messaging might be quite different, and they'll say to the members, right, we're going to go out on strike until the employer does X. And so they've actually planned a way to get that workforce back into the workplace and end the strike, right, by predicting or predicating some response or consequence from the employer that's going to be the precipitating move.
Really interesting. And actually, I think this tees up nicely what I hope will be one of our future episodes on this, which is around tactics of striking in industrial relations. And perhaps that is a good moment at which to wrap up and hopefully leave our listeners hungry for our next episodes on this topic.
That sounds good to me. What have we learned today, Miranda?
Well, I've learned a lot about the differences between the kind of cultural differences between US strikes and UK strikes. I'm particularly interested in this concept of a lockout and the idea that once you go on strike, you stay on strike until further notice, which is very different from what we see here.
And I've learned something really interesting, which as much as I've thought about and studied differences between industrial labor relation systems in the United Kingdom and in the United States, them being so broadly similar, I never really stopped to contemplate some of the fundamentals, which is that when you have a labor dispute in the United Kingdom, especially one that makes the headlines, it's frequently in the public sector, not in the private sector. And this is what can prove so incredibly disruptive to people's lives, where you have this notion of government service provision across the UK, whether that's in healthcare or in transportation and public transport. Whereas in the United States, the difference, the impact being felt regionally or locally due to a particular workforce at this workplace or this factory or this hospital, is the damage can be so much more localized.
Great. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you about it, Josh. Thank you.
I look forward to the next time. Let's get into it again.
Great. Goodbye for now.